Hello everyone, my name is Michelle, and today we are going to be delving into a deeply personal and challenging story, but one that I think is important to share. But this isn't just a story, it's a testament to resilience and surviving a complex upbringing. I very much appreciate you being willing to share your story, and without further ado, let's get into the video. We were born into a family that was built on chaos. We have two older brothers by two different fathers, then our own father. So that's three different kids by three different men, not that we're judging our mother. We only met our eldest brother's father a couple of times, and he was heavily dependent on alcohol and possibly drugs, but we can't say how dependent he was, but he died quite young. We never met our older brother's father because our mother claims she doesn't know who he is. Then there's our father. Our father was textbook abusive, whereas our mother was negligent primarily due to circumstances, and we hypothesize a challenging upbringing of her own. We have medical records that show we contracted diseases, not STIs, but diseases that can be transmitted to others by intercourse, such as oral thrush when we were less than a month old, and a severe UTI when we were around 2 years old. We'll never know what actually caused those two conditions to be found in us at those young ages. But our therapist has suggested that it could be indicative of when abuse started, and therefore why we have alters who are babies and toddlers. Our first cohesive memory is when our father is watching a game of soccer, and he refused to feed us because he wanted to watch the game. We'd have been about 3 or 4 then. But recently we've had a memory of a younger alter who recalls being forced into the trunk of a car by our father and taken to a house where we were sexually abused long into the night. Our mother wouldn't have known because she worked nights in a bar at the time. We were 3 years old then. Cut to the beginning of school, where we struggled to fit in right off the bat. We had 2 friends who were cousins, so they spent most of their time playing with each other, while we spent our time sitting in the back of our classroom doing extra math tests to pass the time. We were lonely, but we had school to help us cope with the long-standing SA at the hands of our father and his friends. We look back now and realize that the reason we couldn't fit in was because the stuff we'd tell the other kids was completely unknown to them. We got to age 6 before we fully appreciated that kids don't understand stuff to do with sex, because they didn't teach us that kind of thing in preschool. Here's the part where we struggle to reflect and understand what was really going on behind closed door. Our first suicide attempt was at age 5. We won't go into details about what happened, but we were sitting in the home corner where you played like you were at home, cooking, answering the phone, etc., at our school when it happened. And our teacher noticed before it could escalate, except she didn't notice that what we did was an intentional act. She thought we were playing a game, so no concerns were raised. We had just turned 6 when our parents stated that they were divorcing. Our father walked out of the house after the announcement, and our mother didn't know what to do. She'd been divorced before, but by this time, she'd had a second child by our father, so she thought that this relationship was for life. Nope. We didn't see him for a couple of months, but our life hadn't settled, even without the abuse to cope with. Our mother became dependent on alcohol, relied heavily upon our maternal grandparents and uncles to raise her 4 children, and she ended up in hospital having made an attempt on her life. We had to stay with our grandparents for a few days and then our uncle for a little while longer. Unfortunately, our grandfather was not exactly what you'd want in a grandparent. He'd wait for our grandmother to go out. She didn't drive, so she relied on walking and buses, so she was often out for a long time. And he'd sexually abuse us. Then, when we lived with our uncle, we were privy to some conversations that maybe we shouldn't have been aware of. His partner at the time was cheating on him, and when she found out, we were in a lot of trouble, but not how you'd think. Some people have aversions to food and drink because of taste, texture, smell, etc. We have an aversion to cranberry juice because of this. She poured poured us a glass of cranberry juice and said, "Oh, here's something to make you feel happy," and then added 2 things: vodka and something we still don't know what it was. But given that we now know about her, we suspect we were drugged as well as given a heavy drink of vodka and cranberry. To that end, we also can't drink vodka. We don't remember much of what happened that night, other than the man she was with, not our uncle, put us to bed. That's it. We like to think that it was just the alcohol and drugs that were involved in making that night horrible, but we don't know. We weren't aware. Anyway, a few weeks later, our uncle and his partner moved to Morocco, and our mother was out of hospital, able to take care of her kids again. We remember one school assembly very vividly, because that's what taught us that what had been happening to us wasn't right. The assembly was about child abuse and what to do if you were being abused. We wrote notes on this assembly because, as happens when you're confronted with bad things in your life, you try to deny they ever happened. And we were like, oh well, we'd best make sure we know the signs of abuse and what to do, just in case. We forgot everything, including the sexual abuse from our father, which by this point had restarted, only it was in his friend's house. We'll come back to that later. Then our stepfather came into the scene. He seemed nice at first, but he made us find out what non-sexual physical abuse was. He beat us, strangled us, locked us in rooms, locked us out of the bathroom so we had to go in a bag in our bedroom. It's pretty much a case of, you name it, he's probably done it. The worst was when he said we were lying about something we had or hadn't done. That always involved him grabbing us by our hair and dragging us to the bathroom. At first, he did the classic, wash our mouth out with soap. Then he progressed very quickly into waterboarding us if our answers to his interrogation weren't what he wanted. We were 6 when this started, and the physical torment didn't end until we were 12 and got too big for him to drag around. So life at our mother's house was crap. What about when we visited our father at his friend's house? Well, aside from being sexually abused by our father, his friend was also sexually abusing us. Only he had a camera and other friends. It was like some sort of torture, and in many ways it still is. Because the difficult part about being filmed like that isn't necessarily the actual abuse, but knowing that somewhere out there, someone has material of you being abused. Our father's friend abused us until we were around 9, and our father moved away from that house. Yay. A lot of stuff is hazy around that time, but one thing does stand out. We were noticing internal voices when we were about 8. We told one of our friends at school that we had voices in our head, and she said we had to keep it a secret or we'd get in trouble. So we were ignoring each other, basically. We'd never heard of DID or schizophrenia or anything else that would have caused internal voices. So we all collectively started to ignore each other, pretending that none of the voices existed. Cut to being 13, our older brother sexually assaulted us in our bathroom while we watched our favorite film. It was horrifying, but it also pinpointed a significant development in our awareness of dissociation. While it was happening, we were convinced it had lasted maximum 2 hours, the length of the film. Nope. 7 hours had passed from our brother starting the abuse to us finally being able to make it stop. We'd frozen. We couldn't speak. We couldn't cry out. Nothing. Then suddenly consciousness clicked back in and we were able to cry out in pain. He stopped. We moved away and said, "You shouldn't leave." He left. We checked our phone. 4:30 a.m. We went to the bathroom to check for blood or other signs of damage. Thankfully, we seemed pretty okay physically and we went to sleep. Somehow we made it to turning 14. We developed a good friendship with someone in our school. We told them that we had been assaulted over summer break and they said we had to tell a teacher. We planned which teacher, what day, what time, etc. so we could both be there. Except when the day came, we wussed out. Our friend showed our teacher the text we'd exchanged about the abuse and he came out of the classroom to find us in a ball on the floor. We looked at him and he was pale with shock. He said said we had to tell someone with more seniority, which we did. Cut to about 6 months later, and one of the alters in our system decided he'd had enough of being ignored. He got us into trouble at school in order to make himself known. That resulted in us restarting what we now know as system communication. We were 18 when we discovered what things like schizophrenia and DID really meant. We heard the words being thrown around. Dissociative was pretty popular amongst our friends at the time, so we made a point of never watching Dissociative's content because it was popular, and we didn't want to fall into that popular culture mindset. We've never followed the same mindset as our peers. But anyway, we got into higher education, and immediately problems started cropping up. We were referred to the university counselor, who said we were, and I quote, beyond him. So he referred us into a scheme that our university had for students' mental health. We saw a psychologist who listened to us, our history that we couldn't remember, which was minimal, and the fact that we had 5 distinct voices who seemed to all have different personalities. He said, "Have you heard of dissociative identity disorder?" And we said yes, because we had, and we'd read about it in a book, but we didn't really believe that we had it or that we could have it. Then that psychologist referred us to a psychiatrist who did so many tests with us, got to know us, met a few of us, and in May 2020, we were officially diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. We were in denial at first, but then as more traumatic memories surfaced, we thought that he might have had a point. Maybe we did have this DID. We mentioned it to a few of our friends with mixed results. One said, "Yeah, that makes sense how you act sometimes." Another said, "Wow, you should watch Dissociative. They're really informative." As stated previously, we didn't want to go with the crowd, and Dissociative was picking up traction because of the Anthony Padilla video. It was a bit weird. Nowadays, aged 23, we live alone with carers supporting us, a social worker supporting us, a new psychiatrist who pretty much knows everything about us, including that we ought to have been diagnosed with BPD by our last psychiatrist, a new psychologist who is working with us to get functional multiplicity, and we've just got out of a toxic AF relationship. So we're doing okay. We have our downs, but who doesn't? One day at a time. In today's story, we saw how chronic childhood trauma can alter your brain's development. You are able to see the development of dissociation from this sustained trauma, where you are able to detach from reality to distance yourself from the pain. It's a complex story where if you can't remember this trauma occurring, how could you possibly have DID? But I'm glad that you have your diagnosis now and are able to take steps moving forward. Repression is a coping mechanism where your brain tries to unconsciously distance itself from the conscious mind. This is done to protect you from the emotional pain associated with these memories. Again, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I'm happy to hear that things can feel better sometimes. Thank you again to everyone for listening to this complex story. Be sure to take care of yourselves and have a good day, night, whatever the case may be, and goodbye.